Good morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Tom Holmes, Founding Director of Brand Performance, the leading HR and finance transformation consultancy. We focus on, as you know, and deliver global transformation projects with primarily Oracle, SAP and Workday for both finance and for HR, as well as other technology-enabled solutions. And as part of our transformation series of events, we're now addressing this year how to achieve true transformation and how best to prepare for transformation projects so that they deliver what they're intended to, exceed expectations, and of course come in to time and budget. So during today, we're joined by Nick Jackson, who is the Oracle Development Leader in Finance Digital Transformation. And I'm delighted that Nick's with us today to find out, in his experience, how businesses best achieve that level of transformation from finance and actually what it means as well. And so we really want to understand what successful transformation looks like with an Oracle-enabled tool and what we should be doing to prepare ourselves, etc. Now, throughout the event today, there's a chat function at the bottom of the screen, so please use that to submit any questions, and I'll come to those and raise those with Nick as we go through. So, good morning, Nick. Welcome. Could you please explain a little bit to me what Oracle Development Leader in Finance Digital Transformation does, so what your role is and what your wider role is? So, welcome, Nick.
So, apologies for the mouthful of the title. We do like to go in for long names. In essence, my role is largely a market-facing business development role, focusing really on the finance function and how finance leaders can best make use of our cloud technologies to drive business performance and improvement. So that's kind of my day job. I do, as you may be aware, have a second role, which is I'm currently the president of CIMA for this year, the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. So to be fair, I come at this both from a technology and from a people and skills angle, which I think is a combination of those two things that are critical if you're going to be successful in driving financial transformation projects.
Brilliant, Nick. Well, it sounds like you, in both roles, you're eminently qualified to answer or discuss the first of my questions, which is actually, what does finance transformation mean? So if I'm a leading company, I may have been on old technology or even Oracle technology on premise for many years now. What should I be looking to achieve out of the next level of transformation? What's the cutting edge in terms of finance transformation?
About what transformation is about. I mean, when I first joined Oracle 4 years ago, the buzzword was digital transformation. And for me, that's all about being customer focused. It's about significant change. It's not about tinkering around the edges. It's transformation. It's not incremental change. And most importantly, it's data driven. So when you apply that to the finance context, it is the data driven, technology enabled scale of change aspects which are important, as well as customers, both from an external customer point of view, but also from the point of view of, how do we support internal customers? As a finance function, how do you support your internal customers? What is different? Finance transformation has been around for a long time. I remember I was at MOJ many years ago, leading their financial transformation. It's not a new phrase. What is different, though, is the nature of that change as it's driven by new technologies. So traditionally, the finance function was traditionally a pyramid shaped. You started off as an AP clerk, you work your way up the ladder, become a supervisor, and eventually become finance director, classic pyramid. But what, of course, we're now seeing is as AI, automation, machine learning, etc., come into play, the bottom of that pyramid is increasingly going to be simply done through automation. And as a result of that, that changes the role of finance and the nature of finance. And some say is that threatening jobs, but actually in reality, it's actually, I believe, opening up the opportunity for finance to bring significantly more value. And that's kind of what I talk about all the time, is what's the nature of the value that finance can bring by transforming and taking advantage of new digital technologies, moving to the cloud, having regular access to updates of AI, etc.
Could you give us some examples, Nick, of of the kind of tangible transformation which you're seeing your customers, etc., achieve?
Yeah, I can. So I mean, I think it's about simple levels would be, a lot of the effort of finance departments is spent on data. There's some interesting stats that says, up to 60-70% of the time spent by departments, corporate finance functions, is just manipulating data, pulling it together, tidying it up, because they're getting it from multiple sources. They're doing it on spreadsheets. They can't keep it up to date, etc. You've got different versions of the truth. So what we're seeing with customers who are moving to cloud is, because they're moving to a single instance, because it's a consistent set of data, they've got a clear data strategy, they've got a single chart of accounts, etc. They're able to significantly rationalize the time. So for example, we're seeing people able to reforecast 90% quicker than they were before. We're seeing savings in terms of procurement costs, because people are now getting better insight from the information that they've got that's actually predicting, where different deals might be more readily available, etc. So there's a whole range of different business benefits that we're starting to see coming through that automation process.
And I mean, structuring finance data, as you say, it's been a long journey. We've this vision of being able to do strategic sourcing, this vision of being able to get meaningful reforecasted data at great speed, has been something we've talked about for some time. And I'm curious as to what you think has blocked that endeavour, and what is different now, which is going to make it easier to achieve. So how do we solve our data issues, which we've seen for so many years?
I would say that the number one thing in the past has been everyone's had the vision and the theory, and they buy into the theory of it. But frankly, the technology has not been up to it.
Mm-hmm.
And remember how many organizations have grown organically. So they acquire a new organization, they divest, they add bits on. And every time you're doing that, you're bringing someone else's system into your landscape, which increases that complexity. What cloud provides an opportunity to do is to kind of say, let's get rid of that and go to a single place. I mean, a really good example is Oracle's own story. We had 150 different countries that we're working with, over 200 legal entities. And we basically now work off a single instance, a single chart of account across the whole of the globe. That enables us to do really interesting things like closing our books in a matter of days. Indeed, one part of our business worth over $2 billion was closed within one day at the end of the last fiscal. So we're seeing much more ambition as a result. So I think that's what's happening in terms of the technology, being able to be fit for purpose. The other thing is, obviously, you don't drive significant change if you don't have changes in culture and expectations. So I think what's also happened, obviously, in our day-to-day lives, people have got more used and more expectant of engaging through cloud technologies, having things happen immediately. And they know that with that comes compromise, i.e., they have to self-serve. You self-serve in your Amazon Prime, you self-serve in your bank account. You don't get that sent to you anymore. So that expectation about users taking control is starting to overcome the cultural barriers that have been there previously.
Very interesting, very interesting. So many of these themes are not new themes, but what you're describing is that the technology has now caught up to be able to actually deliver these things. And I think we'll come on to that in a moment. I do want to pick up on your other point, which I think is really interesting, about the constant change in organizations. So any organization of size, in my experience, is constantly either swallowing or divesting a new piece of new business area, a new component to what they're doing, etc., or a new purchase, whatever it is. I see that both in private sector, but also in government. Actually, there's always machinery of government changes which involve, and many of our long-term clients, it's kind of, you never get to that still point, and where you can see that kind of green upland, but you never get there, because then things have changed by the time you get over the fence and into it. And I think that's really interesting, because actually the kind of barriers which we used to see were sitting on different platforms, the organization not being able to share data across the new entity until technology had been refined. But I guess the cloud changes that somewhat, Nick, in that you can put both entities out there on the cloud much more rapidly than if it were within the individual technology estates of each of the entities.
So two things. One is, yes, you can put both entities out there, but actually I would say it's more the fact that with cloud you can expand and contract much more easily. So if you take another entity on board, you haven't got to then increase your own data center capacity, because you're already on Oracle's own data center. So you just increase the bandwidth that you require from us, and that's the beauty of going onto a public cloud, is that you've got that capability to readily switch up and switch down. And then I guess the other angle to this is thinking about the user experience and how easily they can adapt to a new technology. So because it's much more, I guess, user-orientated technologies that we're using, it's easier for someone coming from a new entity or with a mortgage change to adapt to that, whatever the new way of working is. So I think it's quite positive in that way. The cloud really just, again, people are more used to it. You can more flexible ways of working. You don't need to be hardwired into the office. It's been great for those organizations, obviously, in the current climate, who had already moved to cloud, have found it much easier to adapt, their ways of working practice. And I think that's symptomatic of the way it is when you've got new organizations restructuring. And then the final thing just to mention is, in the past, what you would have, I remember I used to sell Oracle in the past, and one of the big challenges there would be you fix your chart of account, you do your implementation, and that is it. If you want to change the structure, you're talking about major upgrade, major re-implementations. Nowadays, the technology is there that you can do controlled transfers without impacting the organization. So again, if you want to restructure, you need to restructure. You can do that nowadays without compromising the integrity of your accounting structures underneath.
Well, I mean, I think that is very interesting, and that is something which, at Brand Performance, it's something we've been working on a lot, and we call it kind of the cloud mindset. And it's this idea that in moving to a cloud system, that is the last physical move of data and transactions which one is going to make. But one has to have a mindset of continually growing that over time. And I think this is something which has really been a problem for large-scale ERP users in the past, where, taking the next release, using it, and not just storing it up and then doing a massive upgrade later on, is something which I think has been a fundamental problem. And it does involve a bit of a mindset change. We call it the cloud mindset, of course, and train people in it and get them working and thinking in that way. But it's really different from what we've seen before, right, Nick?
Well, I think we do quarterly releases. So every quarter we are releasing some updates to our system, some new capabilities, etc. So what we found is interesting, certainly when we first started with our cloud releases, and we've been, first go live in the UK was 2014 with cloud. So we are a mature product, but certainly in the early days, we found customers kind of weren't ready for it. It was, they weren't able to accept the new releases because they hadn't got themselves ready to cope with that continuous change that it required. The beauty of it now, I think, is customers are much more geared up to understanding, okay, so we're going to get the new releases coming this quarter. This is what it's going to involve. Who do we need to engage in terms of the business process stuff, etc. So it becomes much more, again, it's in their gift. It's in the organization's gift. They're not in the gift of the SIs anymore. And your big SIs will do the implementation, but thereafter it's a relationship between us as a provider, as a system service provider of the cloud service, and the end customer. That's where the relationship lies. And the customer gets to determine what they accept from each release and what they don't, and the pace of change that they can absorb. So I think it's much more empowering for the recipient, for the customer, than perhaps it has been in the past.
It's very interesting because you're describing actually another flavor of these sunlit uplands, which we've always kind of dreamed about. That transformation jumps us into that space and then everything's okay. When actually what you're describing is that organizations are constantly changing in the way they operate and growing and shrinking, etc. And at the same time, the technology is also moving on all of the time. So that cloud mindset is actually part of the transformation journey I see for finance, is moving finance professionals and finance operational staff into a world where they embrace something which is going to change over time and continuously. And that's a new thing for accountants, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I have talked about the concept of dynamic operating model. So we're all familiar with transformation, which is I define a target operating model, I define the as-is state, and I define a journey going from where I am to where I want to be. The reality is the world is moving too fast that by the time you've got your business case signed up for your target operating model, some other new technologies is available, or the new version of Uber has arrived to completely disrupt your whole marketplace. So you can't afford to wait for the Tom to arrive. So in the dynamic operating model, this is a world where you're trying to create the conditions that enable you to respond quickly or to preempt. And those conditions for me, one is cloud. The second is around data, having a really clear data strategy, because if you understand that, you know where you can switch on and switch off. Thirdly, you've got to have the right skills. People need to be trained and know what those skills are. And I can talk a bit more about where we're seeing those skills gaps in the finance department. But fourthly, you've got to have the right culture, the right attitudes. Again, you've got to be willing to embrace the new technology and to embrace a world where things are continually changing, and there isn't such a thing as certainty anymore.
And I'm also, I'm thinking about this finance transformation thing more clearly already from what you said. Because you also mentioned how self-service, managers, staff members, doing their own transactions is more important. I'm imagining that also means that finance support teams are more coach and enabler to those team members to get these transactions right, to understand what they're doing, to understand the implication of them so that they're coming in. So this is a very significant change from the way some finance departments still work, which is slightly hidden away in the background, I'm guessing, Nick.
Well, even more so, actually, I would say that checking it's right, that's what the system will do. The system will say, sorry, Tom, that wasn't quite right, that doesn't match. Or, Tom, are you sure you want to sign off this expense? Because you usually reject this type of expense because we've looked at what you've done before. The machine will do that stuff. What it means for finance is actually our role becomes much more value adding, as in I talk about the phrase strategic business partnering, which we are all used to business partners. Great, they're very important. But let me give you an example of what that used to mean. In the old world, when I was a CFO, my finance business partner would come to me and say, Nick, here's your monthly report. The numbers have changed. And I'd go, that's really interesting, Keith. Can you, not very helpful. Can you go away and give me a bit more information? So next month he'd come back and he'd say, Nick, the numbers have changed. And I found out why they changed. I said, Keith, that's really helpful. I now know why they've changed, but it's not really, I want you to give me a bit more. So next time he comes back and he says, I found out why the numbers have changed. I've spoken to the various bits of the organization to understand what our options are to deal with those numbers or to exploit the opportunity. Here's a recommendation, Nick. Here's my opinion. Here are the pros and cons. Here's the risks. That's finance adding value, and that's finance business partnering being more strategic, because they're then helping business to make decisions. And then they go beyond that and say, having had that conversation, made a recommendation, implemented it, then finance can then monitor and check the impact of that decision. So that's finance moving from just an information provider, an insight provider, to actually having influence and impact upon the organization. And that, I think, is the real opportunity that lies ahead.
It's really, yes, I'm actually finding this, what you're describing, is actually quite exciting. So this really is significant change to finance. This is moving into a cloud mindset, and it is presumably a challenge to many of our finance colleagues, where their role is changing under their feet, I guess, Nick.
I mean, it is a difficult one. With my SEMA hat on, we are looking at, you've got a change in structure. Who do you train at what level? How do you make sure people have got relevant skills for today and can make that move? So, for example, 2019, we've completely changed our syllabus 2 years ago to focus on digital. Is now at the heart of it. We're now actually in the process of reviewing it again to put make data analytics much more part of it, because that is the number one skill set that CFOs are saying they're missing within their finance teams. Some finance teams are recruiting data scientists, others want to upskill their people. But I think there is a real challenge to, I guess, without being too brutal, mid-career challenge where you've grown up with a traditional model, but you now need to adapt to actually be able to play a much more fulfilling much more fulfilling role. And that involves, we'd say, soft skills, but actually they're quite hard. But those skills around having influence, being able to negotiate. I'm used to a lot of my colleagues, they like sitting with their spreadsheets. That's what they do. That's what they're comfortable doing, preparing reports, sending them out. But actually that's no longer the future work. The future work is, I take the report to you, Tom, and I talk you through it, and we have a conversation about how that can work. It's much more of a dynamic two-way way of working.
Yes, so you're describing a change where it's pushing in two directions. One is a more transformative, change-led persuasion and discussion and analytical side, and the second part is greater skills in understanding data structure, understanding how data operates, the activities and that side. But whichever way you're looking at, the big space in the middle, which was basically using those data structures to balance the books, if we look at it in simple terms, that part is getting squeezed. Correct. And instead, we either need to move in this direction or that direction as financial professionals.
The model that we developed at SEMA on the back of this was very much around, the bottom gets squeezed out, as you say, but then we think two things will happen. There'll be the strategic business partners. The other thing that we're seeing are kind of centers of excellence, specialisms. So individuals starting to focus on tax or treasury management or FP&A, they're becoming much more specialist in their function. So that's the other trend we're seeing with that change.
Yes, and I suppose that is the third position, which is, so we've got that, the guys are going up there on the change and meaningful business partner way. Then we've got the guys who are the data scientists who really need to understand how data drive it. But then we've got the specialist groups as well in tax and stuff like that, who need to be, I'm assuming, work faster than ever. I mean, one of the characteristics of the last 12 months has been that, even those organizations where there's no change, there's been huge change and huge amounts of challenges in terms of needing to respond to forced changes for many of us very rapidly indeed.
Yeah, I'd agree. And in a way, for a supplier like us, or an organization like us, in a way it's helped because it's taken away a lot of the myth and the fear factor about working in a virtual world. I think because people are doing it day to day, they're much more comfortable with it. A lot of the concerns about security, yes, we do have issues. The world does have issues in terms of security, but it's not been as scary or as dangerous as others might have feared in the past. So I think we are seeing more of an appetite. If I think about a lot of the conversations I'm now having with CFOs, they are not conversations about downsizing or cost reduction. Yes, they want to get their balance sheets back in train. They want to make sure they can, recover what they may have lost. Yeah. But increasingly, they are talking about they need to create pots for investment because they need to invest in technology to drive innovation. That's not just from a finance point of view, but very much from a front office customer experience point of view. But equally, if you can't fulfill that customer experience with the right back office support systems, then you fail in your proposition. So you need to make it easy for people to pay, to get their repayments when things go wrong, etc. It's got to be very easy for the customer to have an end-to-end experience, not just from the front end, but from how finance and HR procurement systems support that underpinning expectation.
Sure. So we're focusing on Oracle today. So actually, you've posed the next question for me, which is, how does Oracle support customers and clients in that journey, that transformative journey? So how does Oracle, your team and the other teams within Oracle and technology itself, I guess, support people in achieving what is now a very significant transformation?
Well, obviously, there are two answers to that. One is the technology, and the other is the services that you wrap around it. So, from a technology point of view, the clear requirement or clear need here is to understand what the requirement actually is from a customer point of view, and help to educate them about this art of the possible. So, for example, prosaically, I might say most of the competition will be 80-20. The 80-20 rule applies, i.e. they can do all the transactional stuff. They can make sure you're able to report effectively. What's important though is what's around that in terms of differentiators for a customer's business. So helping customers think about what's most business critical to them, and making sure that the solution fits that critical business process. If you look at, say, construction, they've got some real challenges around complex project management and project accounting associated with that. How do we make so that's kind of where I think we look at the end-to-end solution rather than just saying generic is good enough. Because one of the challenges on cloud obviously is it's a one size. Yeah, you can configure to fit your requirement, but the core solution is homogeneous. So the question is, what's the added changes that you need to make it then unique to fit you? And that's where our efforts go into. That's where our efforts and the efforts of our partners go in terms of providing that end-to-end wraparound from a technology point of view. So you've got an end-to-end solution. And then the other angle, I guess, which is very much, I think, where you'll be coming from, Tom, is we can put the system in there, but if no one uses it, it's of no value. So in developing that requirement, educating the user, educating the customer about the art of the possible to manage their expectations, so they appreciate, what cloud's going to do for them, what they can do with it, and that's where working with the likes of Varan and other change management consultancies is really important, because they understand the business process, but they also can understand the art of the possible. And again, I would say this is where a lot of business cases fall down. For me, too many business cases focus on TCO, on the total cost of ownership, and they're purely financially based. Increasingly, the benefits are downstream and they're not directly tangible. They may be, for example, improved data quality, to improve data decision making. How do you quantify that? It's the fact, as you alluded to earlier, Tom, the era of 5 years waiting and then a massive multi-million-pound upgrade program, those will go. This is the last big upgrade to cloud, because thereafter the change is incremental. How do you factor those things in your business case is really important to actually really understand the downstream benefit. And then the last thing, just to add to that, I would say, it's just, I use a phrase which is let the users play. So there's something about users will find their way of exploiting what the capability can do. We deliver very complex solutions which are really functionally rich. It is unlikely that the users will be accessing, much beyond 50% of what its capabilities can be. They need to be allowed to play and explore and understand what those capabilities are for themselves.
I mean, another feature of cloud, and I know Oracle finance systems these days, is that they actually can be deployed so much faster. The 18-month program, the 2 years, and etc. That's kind of, you hear about those much less frequently. And I know that from a configuration perspective, from a getting everything ready perspective, one can easily be looking at a kind of 6-month exercise, even in the largest organizations. But to be able to do it in 6 months, that means an acceleration of being able to provide decisions, agreements, sort of data structures, all of that stuff. You need to be ready with that material. And we find one of the biggest challenges is actually preparing not only the business case, but the implications of the business case, so that you can keep up with the speed of the deployment, which is almost lightning speed. And then, you know, you start paying from the day you start the deployment with the big configuration teams, etc., and actually being ready to feed them with all the many decisions of what that future is going to look like, we find involves a lot of prep. I don't know if you're seeing the same, Nick.
No, I'd entirely agree. I think where we see project failure or issues in projects, it's 99 times out of 100, it's the organization isn't ready to go at the pace that the SI and ourselves are ready to go, because, you know, we're bringing templated solutions. We just need you as a business to agree with what we're taking or not, or to be ready to have a conversation about where you need to tweak it. And yeah, they've got the critical thing for me within the organization is having the right governance in place that can respond quickly to what's going on from the technology side. And as you say, some things you can't, let's design the chart of account up front. Yeah, or let's have a conversation during the procurement process about what your options are, what the restrictions are about the chart of account, the data structures, etc.
Right, because that's question number one, isn't it? You know, SI arrives, started the program. We've decided to move to the Oracle technology bit. So the questions are: what's your chart of accounts? What's the natural accounts going to look like? What's the future of this? What's the org structure going to look like? All that stuff is almost immediate now, because, you know, the ability to migrate it into the cloud and the instance is unrestrained compared to what it used to be. And it really is that these implementations now can work as fast as you are ready.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's yeah, we can't overplay that though. You know, there is, you know, you have got to make sure you're taking the customer with you, and they don't feel done to. So that's the other angle to this to bear in mind. You know, the change management process is not one you can short circuit, I would say. But in terms of the ability to actually deploy a solution, yes, that's really quick. Particularly, you know, and there are different approaches that different organizations are taking. So some will take it function by function. So say we're doing finance, HR, procurement, yeah, then it's not all in one go. Others might take so some of our large global customers, you know, they'll roll out geography by geography. So again, it's understanding the pace of change that customers can go at. But in terms of the deployment, that's relatively, I'd say, straightforward and fast, particularly when you've got a solution like Oracle's where, you know, we are mature. We've gone through a lot of that pain in terms of, you know, like with any new technology, you will always, in the early days, you'll have challenges in terms of capability and expectations. A lot of that is now, you know, dealt with. And indeed, we have a very good mechanism now to get customers' input. So we have a thing called Customer Connect. So any of our live customers are basically part of a club, and they can sign in, they can express their point of view, they can seek advice from other customers. And also it becomes a mechanism by which we understand what's working, what isn't working. We feed that into our deployment, our development cycle. So our development is informed by customer input rather than just being done in the old days would be an ivory tower of second guessing what it is our customers actually do require.
Very interesting. I mean, I think one of the other challenges, which we haven't really touched on, one of our questioners is asking about, is the link to HR and how this works. Because I don't know about you, Nick, but I've got a lot of experience of HR and finance systems basically not linking, or in the kind of thinnest possible manner.
Yeah.
And are you seeing a change in that area? Are you seeing clients seeking to link them more closely? And if so, what are their challenges?
So what I would say on that is, I recall when I was working at the Treasury, and we had an Oracle system, not cloud. This is back in 2010. And the frustration I had trying to manage, I managed then, I think, about a third of the total budget of the Treasury at the time. And your HR numbers never matched your finance numbers, you know, always out of sync, real frustration. but actually, so that single version of the truth we're now getting with cloud, with finance and HR together is great, and from a simple level. But actually, increasingly important, I think, is thinking about the workforce side of things and workforce management. Planning, particularly in the run-up to Brexit, in a post-Brexit world, we're seeing a lot of organisations wanting to understand how to manage their workforce planning from a more strategic, longer-term point of view, and to understand the financial implications, both positive and negative. So those kinds of areas where you want finance and HR to join up around planning are really important, really facilitates that. So the more synergies you have across finance, HR, and indeed we're seeing some areas where customer service actually really brings that extra data dimension to bear, is really important. And then the fourth angle I bring to that is supply chain. So a lot of CFOs probably hid behind contracts on supply chain pre-COVID. It just happened. That wasn't their problem. But actually, COVID has exposed the vulnerability of the supply chain. And when you've got issues like ESG reporting, environment, societal governance reporting that's coming as the next big differentiator in finance, certainly for a lot of organizations. Organizations now need to be on top of their supply chains to understand whether things are sourced properly, sourced from sustainable sources, whether there's any sense of social exploitation in their supply chain. So bringing that into play together with finance and HR becomes really important to understand that complete picture.
I think that I'll pick up on one of those areas before we finish, which is actually the workforce planning one. I think that's absolutely fascinating. And there is not a single business I have spoken to in the last 6 to 8 months who have not put workforce planning absolutely central to their business case, to their what they're seeking from the shift into the cloud, and central to their plans. But it does involve finance and HR working incredibly closely and thinking about the data structures in a similar manner. And I do think it's actually, when you talk about business cases and leap of faith and stuff like that, in that workforce planning, there sits most organizations' strongest hidden business case, I think, Nick.
And I think also about the ability to run different planning scenarios rapidly and repeatedly and off the latest data. So understanding the latest external, internal data and being able quickly to run it. Most of this stuff is done on spreadsheets, as you know. And when someone says, let's change an assumption, it takes another couple of days to get that assumption feeding through the HR model and the finance model. Oh, we now have an answer. But technology now is you can bring those things together in a single environment, single set of assumptions. You can readily change, and just do it at a switch of a button. It's not a hard thing to do.
Nick, it's been fantastic to speak to you. I'd like to actually ask you about your other role, the SEMA presidency role, and what you're up to the next few months, because I know that you're halfway through your presidency. So how's that going, and what should we as accountants and management accountants be engaging with over there at SEMA?
So I have a theme. Every president has a theme. My theme is responsible financial leadership, which I'm taking very much. I talked about ESG earlier. So for me, it's very much about the opportunity that's available for finance organizations to be front and center, owning that topic within their organizations. What's finance got to do with environment, society? Who knows? Yeah. But actually, the reality is all of that. If regulators are increasingly wanting to drive that agenda forward, customers are expecting organizations to be demonstrating how they are sourcing ethically, sourcing sustainably, understanding the impact they have on their environment. That's all about data and being on top of data and reporting. And that's what our profession is all about. It's a profession that is founded upon ethics, integrity, i.e. looking at data objectively, reporting it as you find it. And I think there's a real opportunity for finance leaders to own that ESG agenda and therefore, be able to bring much more value to their organizations we're not about rear view mirror, looking at the history of finance. We should be much more about forward looking and helping our organizations deliver.
Absolutely. That's really exciting. I mean, you know, getting the 50% target, which Biden's talking about, etc., that's going to turn into financial and measurable targets. We're going to have to prove we're making our contributions, I think, to achieve those kind of targets.
You hear CEOs standing up and making claims about how their source, but you only have to look at stories like Boohoo, who suddenly find, oh, actually, there's slave labor being used in their factories. You can't. The reputational damage is really dangerous. So it is, you say, about being on top of the numbers, on top of the reporting. That makes it show that you are substance over form, not form over substance.
Wow, love that. So substance over form to help with the reform agenda in terms of environmental, in terms of all the other things outside finance, led by the finance department. Nick, that was fantastic. Thank you very much for that ending. That's kind of really brought to me alive the transformation journey which finance professionals need to make, and actually made it quite exciting now as well. So Nick, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the audience for attending too. It's great to get an insight about both where Oracle's direction is, how Oracle's supporting, and also your views on the future of the finance function. So Nick, thank you very much, and thank you everybody else.
Thank you, Tom.